The Autistic Radio Conference Tour 2025 is a co-production with Bild, the Restraint Reduction Network, and Autistic Association. We are open to co-productions with professional organisations where our ethics and interests coincide and align. This short series of short podcasts demonstrate cooperations that are possible, recordings with people at the conference, speaking openly, clearly, with equity in the communication. Hello again, thank you for listening in to Autistic Radio. We really do appreciate your attention. At the Restraint Reduction Network conference here in Liverpool, I'm meeting a number of professionals who have different experiences and different activities relating to the use of excessive restraint that is often not understood by the people who, the subjects of that restraint. Today I have somebody who wants to talk about restraint in an educational setting.
Yes, I'm Ben Higgins. I work for Bild and the Restraint Reduction Network. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to talk to you today, particularly passionate about reducing restrictive practices, and I suppose we're especially interested in reducing restrictive practices in schools, as that's my background.
So when you spoke to me earlier, you said, are our listeners interested in the situation in schools? And I will tell you right now that our listeners are very interested in the situation in schools.
Well, my background is working in schools before the voluntary sector, and I hope practice in some areas is improving. There are really good schools and really good special schools, really good mainstream schools, but we've got a long way to go, especially in terms of meeting the needs of autistic students. And my concern is too often we don't meet people's needs, and as a result of not meeting people's needs, they become distressed, and as a result of becoming distressed, they end up being restrained. And we still go into too many schools, particularly special schools, and find these rooms. They often have these names that sound very lovely, the rainbow room, the sensory room. But when we look at them more closely and observe the practice, we see often autistic children, who might be children with learning disabilities, who have become distressed, and they're dragged across the school and put into these rooms. Sometimes they can't get out because the handle's so high and they can't reach them. So we would consider this enforced isolation. I certainly don't consider it a sensory room or having any therapeutic value or a place that people will be able to calm. People will be scared and become more distressed rather than calmer. It certainly provides no opportunity for co-regulation when you're locked in a room, unable to get out on your own in a distressed state. So we're really keen to see a change of practice here, and we're working with different governments across the British Isles trying to look at how do we get better legislation around this. And we have Daniel Johnson, MP, joined us this morning. He's got a private members bill. He's trying to address this issue. There's different types of practice, and they get muddled within schools in terms of terminology and misleading terminology. But we use the term enforced isolation, and it is harmful practice. That's very different to a child who is distressed being able to ask to leave the classroom and walk out the classroom and go and sit on the swings to calm, that they've chosen to do, and it's child-led time out. That is very, very different to this really harmful practice we're talking about, where people are dragged across the school against their will through restrictive practices and locked in a room against their will, which is a far cry from meeting people's needs.
You described this as hidden, didn't you?
Possibly. I certainly think it is a hidden practice, whether it's in schools, mental health institutions, social care. You speak to most people, they seem shocked that this even exists in this day and age. And you just think, what are we doing? I thought this practice had ended, 10, 20 years ago. And I really hope in 5 years' time we'll look back and think, things like seclusion and locking people in rooms in schools, is a practice of the past. And that's certainly something that we're fighting for.
So exclusion is a restrictive practice. Sending people to a room with their toys is a restrictive practice, almost as much psychologically perhaps as physical restrictive practice, maybe? Or am I leading?
Yeah, there are different types of restrictive practice. There's obviously physical restraint, there's environmental restraint, but there is this psychological restraint and coercion and blanket restrictions that also go on within schools. We know The rates of exclusion for autistic people are way higher than the rest of the population. Equally, the school refusals way higher than the rest of the population. And levels of restricted practice are way higher than it is for the rest of the population. And all of these things, I think, are linked. It's not surprising that people are refusing to come to school if that is their experience, that when they become distressed, rather than teachers thinking, hang on, what have I done? How am I going to meet the needs differently? How am I going to prevent this happening again? Instead, the blame becomes far too quickly on the child, on the autistic person. And we need to change the narrative on that urgently. The levels of school exclusion are going up. The levels of school refusal are going up. I sometimes think we're better at this in adult mental health or social care. The services, the institution, the adults, the professionals taking responsibility for when they don't meet people's needs and thinking, how are we going to do it differently? In schools, it's the opposite of that. It's the child's fault. The child's the problem. They're interfering with the learning of others. They should be put in detention. They should be sent out of the classroom. They should be excluded from school. And never any curiosity about actually what's going on here. What's the experience of the child? In what way have we not met the needs of that child? That might be they have additional needs that have not been met. It might be they've had some degree of trauma over there. It might even be they sexually abused a few weeks ago. Surely, as the professionals, we need to be a bit more curious and actually not just point fingers of blame at the children. That has to change. We're so focused on academic results, but actually people can only learn if we support their well-being and they feel safe at school. And for too many people, particularly autistic students, that's sadly not the case.
I'm a 60-year-old autistic child. I don't think in my schooling what you have described existed. I think I lived in an era of corporal punishment, perhaps, although it was dying out. But what you're describing, I perceive, is a worse situation that has developed over time. What were the drivers to make this happen?
I ask myself that question a lot. I mean, why does this happen, particularly in schools? So we talk about restraint reduction really as a culture change program. It's about creating positive cultures where people feel safe, feel welcome. There's some of the words we've heard during a conference. Children feeling like they belong in the school. And yet these things are actually missing in a lot of schools. We don't get the culture right. The other thing is around power differentials. Restraint reduction is also about addressing power differentials that exist between people. And that happens through othering. So I think autistic people experience that more than others. But it also happens between adult and children, that I think there are these power differentials that you see exist in schools way more than in adult services. It reinforces this practice that it's almost seen as okay. There's a responsibility of governments to put their head above the parapet more and do more like what Daniel Johnson's doing in Scotland, to actually say, this practice is not okay, it is harmful, and we need interventions to be therapeutic and help people. Why we have interventions that actually deliberately cause harm for people and think that is okay, I just can't understand it.
People leaving school now, here in the UK, are less likely to go into work, less likely to become part of what we call regular society or normal society. There are higher numbers of never worked young people than ever before. Has the breakdown in the relationship between those who are in loco parentis, the administrators of school, led to this increase now in NEET, not in education, work or training people?
Quite possibly. A few reflections as you ask. There are a few quotes that have come up over the last couple of days that feel particularly powerful. One for me is within schools, quite often the child that behaves in maybe the least lovable ways is the one that most needs the love. Yet we fail to do that. And I guess that is, relational. That is about how we relate to people. Another is for teachers. People talk about teachers needing to be passionate about their subject. And obviously that's important, but be much more passionate about the people that you're there to teach and the influence that you can have on their lives. And sometimes it feels that's missing. Maybe it's the unfair demands on teachers, and there might be a number of reasons for it. But absolutely it is a barrier, and there needs to be that better relationship between the child and the teachers. And there are lots of great teachers out there, and lots of people have good experiences in schools, but there are too many young people who don't have the benefit of good experiences with teachers. So clearly that is something we do need to work on. But I do think, relationships are at the heart of this, and there is a responsibility on schools to ensure those relationships happen, particularly for those that are struggling most in schools, who we're not meeting the needs of, because it's only through relating that we're going to better understand people to meet their needs.
Here on Autistic Radio, we are very loath to criticise professional educators who are struggling in difficult circumstances. We understand the pressures that they are under. Those pressures have come from outside, it feels to us. So are there simpler, less critical ways of addressing this issue to the teaching profession?
I completely agree with you, Jules. This is not a case of teacher bashing or schools bashing, but it is, you mentioned the world's changed and, people leaving school are more likely to be neat. I do reflect, though, how much of schools really evolved over the years. And actually schools, a lot of them still set up in quite a sort of Victorian way with, rows of tables and chairs and quite a punitive sort of system. And we know for a lot of learners that doesn't work. That's not what they need. And so you do see other types of schools that are based outdoors, and they're forest schools and different models. Institutional schooling does not work for everybody. And I think different people need different types of provision. So it's great to see that sort of evolving in different types of provision. But I think we do need to get away from this quite punitive approach that a lot of schools are based on. And it is possible, because there are a lot of great schools that don't use those approaches and much more trauma informed and much more relational. I suppose you mentioned about relationship. It shouldn't be reward and punishment. It's about relationships with people.
Bild has resources to help people in post at this moment. Could you point the teaching profession and the educators out there towards free resources?
Yes. So a lot of schools and mental health hospitals, care homes will say to us, we recognise we've got an over-reliance on restricted practice. No teacher wants to be restraining children, but it can become part of routine practice, which is a huge concern. So I think it's no use us just saying, well, let's reduce reliance on restraint. It's how you do that. And there is a framework called the 6 core strategies, which looks at importantly involving people with lived experience. And that goes back to the relationship piece. But leadership, leaders putting their head above the parapet, having data. You can only reduce restricted practices if you can have the data to track and know that's the case. It's about learning and debriefing after incidents. Let's make sure everyone's okay first, but then let's learn and look at how we do this differently so it doesn't become sort of standard practice. So we've got lots of useful resources around the 6 core strategies on the Restraint Reduction Network website. So do have a look at that.
I've listened carefully to everything you've said, and people at home will be able to listen carefully and rewind and go over specific points. Thank you for coming and speaking and putting your voice out there on Autistic Radio today.
Thanks for the opportunity.
We speak. Our words, we listen.
We speak. Our words, we listen.
We speak. Our words, we listen.
We speak. Our words, we listen.